Efter interviewet med Patrick Moore, modtog jeg en del opfølgende spørgsmål fra jer. I denne første del svarer Patrick Moore på nogle af de spørgsmål, jeg har modtaget fra jer brugere af Klimarealisme. Velkommen indenfor. Dr. Patrick Moore, thank you for joining us once again. I appreciate it.
Nice to be back with you, Ricky. Lots more to talk about.
After our last interview, I got a lot of questions and been asked if you can do this interview. So I received a lot of questions from our users, and let's get started with the first question. If one take the starting point with all the measurement, the scientific measurement about this, the temperature rise and the ice melting and extreme weather events, nothing really seems to indicate some kind of climate catastrophe or climate crisis for that matter. It's been clear for the last maybe 20 years.
Well, it's not just a scientific measurement, it's just going outside and looking at the weather and what's happening. Yes, there are extreme weather events all through the history of the world. Heavy rainstorms, periods with no rain and drought, floods and crop failure has been something that has happened all through the history of civilization, and we have very little of that today. With the global system we have of food production and increasing yields, largely due to more CO2 in the atmosphere, is why we are getting higher yields of our grains and food crops these days. The trees are all growing faster. There is a good study from Germany which shows in a research forest that has been monitored since 1880 that since 1950 the tree growth has increased by 40 to 60%. This is a huge increase. And this is exactly why greenhouse growers put carbon dioxide into their greenhouses double and triple what it is in the natural environment. Even today, with our additions, they do that to get 30 to 60% more yield of the crop in their greenhouse. Because today, even with the increase we have made, plants are still starving for CO2 in the wild, in nature. So every tree and every plant which is growing out in nature, as long as it is getting enough water and minerals from the soil, the main cause for slowing its growth is lack of carbon dioxide. And so it's the exact opposite of what people are being told. People are being told there's too much carbon dioxide, when in fact, carbon dioxide is lower now than it has been through most of the history of life on Earth, which is 3 billion plus years. And it's actually a cold temperature now. You can see behind me is a poster of the view from my home, and I am only about halfway to the North Pole from the equator. As I go further towards the North Pole, there's colder and colder and colder until it becomes all ice at the North Pole. This was not the case until a few million years ago, is when this cold period came on to the Earth's climate for the first time in 250 million years. So you can see I am studying the long-term history of the Earth's climate, not what it was like yesterday compared to today. That's weather. And for many years, the climate alarmists said if you talked about weather, they said, oh, no, that's just weather, that's not the climate. You have to think about the climate. Well, now all they talk is the weather. So it just keeps changing the goalposts as time goes by, because we can see that there hasn't been any dramatic change in the world's climate since people started worrying about it. And this just we have to realize this as a fact. It is a cold period in the history of the Earth's climate today, and carbon dioxide is at a low level in the history of carbon dioxide during the existence of life on Earth, and that is today. It is at a low level, even with the human input. And this is all very easy to find on the internet. And it's even easier to find in my book, Fake Invisible Catastrophes and Threats of Doom, You Will Perish in Flames, which is a joke from Ghostbusters, the movie. In Ghostbusters, Rick Moranis told the driver of the horse and buggy, "You will perish in flames," because the, the evil was coming, the ghosts were coming. And climate change is like a ghost. It doesn't exist the way they say. There is no severe climate change occurring in the world. There is only severe weather, which has always existed. And even the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says there is no increase in extreme weather events, but that doesn't matter to the extremists. They
Mm.
just say it. They say weather is getting more extreme. They have no evidence
Mm.
to show this, though.
But why doesn't it have any effect on the politician? I'm sure they know about carbon dioxide is plant food, and they know from basic biology in school that plants live of CO2. But why this knowledge? Why is this basic knowledge ignored like it is apparently?
Because of the nature of politics.
Mm.
And let's get to the reason why I wrote this book. I wrote it
Mm.
because I realize that nearly every scare story today about the end of the earth and all these things is based on things which are invisible. Now, carbon
Mm.
dioxide is the main one. Carbon dioxide is blamed for the polar bears to go extinct, the coral reefs to die, for so many things, agriculture to fail. None of this is true, but the fact that CO2 is invisible means that nobody can look and see what carbon dioxide is doing. You can't look across the street and say, look what awful thing is happening there. So when you have something invisible, it invites people who like to scare us. And here are the people who are scaring us. First, the activists with the scare story to get donations to save the earth, Greenpeace and their fellows. So they have a financial reason to use these scare stories that are based on invisible things. Then there are the media. The media want the stories from the activists. They want to put those in the newspapers and say the end is coming or whatever. You know, it's always about the end of the world in some way or another. Whatever that looks like, I have no idea. I'm not sure if it means that the world implodes in or explodes out, or if the oceans all catch on fire at the same time. But to say the end of the world is almost like baby talk, but this is what they say. And so then you have the politicians, coming to your point. The politicians want to be able to tell you they can save your grandchildren from a certain death in the future from climate change. So they have a reason to ignore the biology because no one can see it. The carbon dioxide, which is actually the most important food for all life, is invisible. So they make up a scary story about it, about the end of the earth and the catastrophe and the apocalypse and the doomsday and all the rest, which has been going on through the whole of human history. And yet it has not quite come to an end already. And then there are the scientists. These are the ones who have really sold their soul because they're supposed to be scientists and they're supposed to look for the truth. But in fact, even the scientists are using this climate catastrophe scare story to make money from the government in the form of grants to do their research. And they are feeding that to the politicians and the media and the activists. So it is a powerful convergence of financial and political interests, all trying to scare the public into doing what they say. In other words, it's about control as well as about money. It's about power and money. And in a way, it's a bit like the COVID, but I don't want to go in that because I'm talking about the environmental aspects. but it's similar in many other fields too, where they're scaring you about something. Here they are scaring you about GMOs, they are scaring you about nuclear energy, which radiation is invisible. Let's just look at GMOs for a minute. What is in the GMO that could be harmful? Not necessarily proven even, but what could be in there that is harmful? Well, for one thing, it must be invisible, because has anybody shown you on their hand what the thing is in the GMO which could hurt you? Or can they show you in a 10 million times electron microscope what is in the GMO that can hurt you? No, they cannot. That's because it has no name. Not only that, it has no chemical formula, whatever this thing is. How could people believe that there is something in the food which has no name that will hurt you, or that has no chemical formula? Even more precise from a scientific point of view, everything has a chemical formula. There's nothing which is not made of the elements of the universe: carbon and oxygen and hydrogen and magnesium and calcium and whatever. What is this chemical in the GMO that is harmful? The truth is, it does not exist. It's like the Pacific garbage patch, another one of my favorite scare stories that actually does not exist. They just make it up. Whereas carbon dioxide, they don't make it up. They just make it into a scare story, when in fact it is the most beneficial molecule on the face of the earth for life's existence. A rather different thing than being a catastrophe or an apocalypse. It's the exact opposite of what they are saying. It is one of the most precious things we have on this planet, is the little bit of CO2 in the atmosphere, which most people don't realize is only 0.04%. They call it 400 parts per million. 400 sounds like a big number, but million is a much bigger number than 400, and 400 parts per million is exactly 0.04%, which is so small that what could carbon dioxide do that was evil at such a low level? But it's amazing that it can do something so beneficial at a low level, which is to feed all those trees in the background behind me on the mountains of Vancouver Island. That is what they are eating every day in order to produce the wood that we build our houses with, and the paper that we read as books if we don't have e-books. But many people still read things written on paper and use paper for many other things. So the thing is that people don't even understand where the stuff they're using every day comes from, where their food comes from, where the concrete comes from to build their buildings, and the steel reinforcing that goes inside. They don't realize where their energy is really coming from. They see awful pictures of big mining operations that if you take it from a satellite, you can hardly see it. But if you take it up close, it looks like a big mess. And then they forget to notice that it's going to be all revegetated again after they've finished doing what they're doing. So the people in the city, which is now a very large majority of the human species, they do not have a realistic understanding of how they are even surviving. If you live on the 30th floor of a condominium in a big urban center, you often have a very fake idea about what's really going on in the world, because all you're doing is watching your video screens most of the time and listening to all this fake news over the TV and the radio and in the newspapers about the climate catastrophe. And you look out the window and you see it's raining and the wind is blowing, and you think, yes, it's true, the climate catastrophe is here. I don't see how people can do that myself, to
No.
fool themselves. How do people fool themselves into thinking that there is a climate catastrophe, or any of these other so-called catastrophes like GMO, as I just mentioned? There's nothing in it that could hurt you that they could give
No.
a name to. Usually
I
when there is a pollution, they could tell you the name of it, but not with GMOs.
I think it's most likely people just live their life. They go to work, they have kids, they don't have. If you want to have some kind of understanding of the climate or the climate system, or environment, you have to do a little bit of research on your own. I have to like read a bit, and maybe people don't want it, or don't cannot, or don't have the interest. So they just rely on what the information they get from the news and the government, and they trust the government to tell them more or less the truth, even though they know the politicians have their own agenda. But in general, they believe, and if it's some government institution who tell you that the global warming is becoming a big problem, then they believe in it because they not really have this background understanding, or maybe they forgot what they've been taught in school. So they just like go along with it, and it's been going on for so long, like from the 80s. So this this is kind of the like the near people just don't hear anything else. So if you tell it enough time, then people start to believe it. So I guess it's more like, as you say, people get far away from where the things coming from, and then just living their lives in the city, and then not really pay attention in where the stuff coming from. That's the
Yes,
big thing.
that is the problem, and but the real problem you have pointed out, in fact, is that propaganda actually works. Fake news
Mm,
affects people because
mm,
most people don't have the tools or the knowledge to make a judgment about
mm,
what they're being told. And if you tell
mm,
something over and over and over again, even if it's a lie, eventually people
mm,
will come to believe it. So the only
mm,
solution to this is for people to educate themselves, uh,
mm,
or for somehow for humanity to wake up to
mm.
the falseness of these stories. That's what I'm
Yeah.
trying to do with this book, but it's just me in a book. But many other people are also working on this. I'm with the CO2 Coalition in the United States. I'm Canadian, but I'm a founding director of this group of scientists and economists and engineers. People don't realize that engineers are actually scientists, but it used to be called applied science. In other words, scientists who actually make something useful, instead of just being in a lab doing research, which is useful too, but it isn't something you're going to use every day. Whereas engineers build bridges and roads and cities, and the technology side of it, this computer we're talking, or these computers we're talking over, were made by people who have a really amazing understanding of engineering, electronics, computer science, and all those disciplines. And we need to respect that. Uh, the, the knowledge that exists in this world is greater than it ever has been in the history of our species. But right now, uh, and I'm afraid it's possible that modern communications technology and social media may not be able to be incorporated into human society successfully. It may result in confusion and fear because it's being used for that purpose. And now one person can make a million people afraid just by being on a TV screen or on Twitter. And this concerns me that perhaps we have created something that will be our own downfall in terms of the cohesion of civilization and our ability to take information and make good decisions collectively. This is a bigger philosophical subject, but I think it's one that people need to think about. And to maybe, if people think about it enough and understand it enough, they can overcome what it's doing to them in terms of making them afraid. Because never mind all the politics around this, I think it's actually the fear campaigns that are at the root of controlling people and controlling their minds. Because and that's just about information. It's not necessarily about left or right or center. It's more about control, and through communications, controlling people. And that works on all sides in some ways. But right now, it would appear that the left has a monopoly on the controlling urge. maybe they always did, because you'll see, even though in my book I try to avoid the partisan politics, but because I like to discuss about science and not be accused of being on left or right. I'm actually a centrist in that I'm a conservative from an economic point of view, but I'm a liberal from a social point of view. On the other hand, I do believe in the golden rule, just simply do unto others as you would have others do unto you. And a lot of people are doing things to other people today that they would not want done to themselves, such as the cancel culture, for example, and calling all white people racists. Uh, this is if you call all white people racists, obviously you are a racist, because all white people are not racist. You can't categorize people like that. But this is what is happening in the world today. So that goes against the golden rule, which is to me the center of philosophical position on human behavior, is only do to others what you would like others people to do to you. And if you start there and then look at the various aspects, to divide politics, I just say there are people who wish to control society, and then there are other people who wish to avoid being controlled by society. So everything from libertarians who don't want any control from society, or at least the very minimum, all the way to extremist right wing and left wing people who want to control everything and tell you what to do. So there's a better way to divide human psychology and behavior, is in terms of people who wish to be free from control of society. Like me, I don't want to wear a mask all the time because they tell me I have to. I know that I am breathing out through my mask and breathing in through my mask, right? It isn't stopping, it isn't a barrier to keep me away from the air. I have to have the air to breathe in and breathe out from my lungs. So it's hard to see how that is a fundamental thing that you must do everywhere. People wear their masks when they're driving in their cars. People wear their masks when they're walking alone in the woods. Like, do they wear it to bed at night when they're sleeping by themselves? It's enough to drive a person like me crazy, because I like to see reason being used instead of insanity. But there is much insanity in the world today, as you know.
Indeed. Let's move on to the next question. What is, in your opinion, important to turn people's opinion around and get the journalists to ask the relevant question instead of just going on this strategy or way of global warming and breaking news stories? What would it take for turn people's minds around, to make them realize?
Good question, Ricky.
Yeah.
Yeah, very good question. As far as I can see, the truth explained in an understandable way through the media is the only possible solution to this. And at a certain point, perhaps people will wake up. The pendulum, as they say, can swing so far, and then it gets so far that it has to come back. And it's a lesson in history that we have seen over and over again, that when extremes occur, they tend to wear themselves out and come back to more of a center. Maybe this is an exception to that. Maybe we are in a time now when there will be no end to how far this pendulum goes. I don't see how that's possible myself, but it seems to have gone a tremendous long ways already. And so I can only contribute by writing my book. I can talk on a street corner forever and only a few people will hear me. I'm very happy that my book has, all of last week, was #1 environmental science on Amazon.com, which is the biggest book selling site in the world. So even though I can't compete with a lot of fiction and sensation type books, in the science category and environment category, I am competing very well right now. And so that means people are liking my book, giving it 5-star reviews on Amazon. It has taken off in the United Kingdom, in England, because it's been publicized there a bit. Most of the sales are still in United States and Canada, but I see now Japan is buying it, some people, and also in Australia. So, and it's only been out for some weeks. This book is good for 5 years, uh, as far as I can tell, and I may revise it occasionally as time goes on. But I think it's good for 5 years as a statement of truth about 11 chapters on 11 different issues where I say fake, invisible catastrophes, and threats of doom, which make people afraid, and they should not be afraid because the coral reefs are not dying. The polar bears are not going extinct. In fact, they are growing quite healthy. They've gone from a population of about 6,000 50 years ago to about 35,000 today. They are healthy and population is growing. So most of these stories are complete fabrications. And I hope that more and more people will read this, will read my book, because it does put it into plain English for English speakers, and hopefully will be translated into other languages. But thankfully, many people, even in European countries where English is a second language, there are many people who read English there too. So
Mm.
I'm hoping it will be picked up by people who can read English in all countries of the
But it,
world.
it seems like the world is kind of divided into the West, where we really care about like climate, global warming, and climate. But in the East Asia, like China and India and parts of Russia, they seem to like be less concerned about how the climate behaves. Is it something you meet?
Yes, that is one of the great puzzles about why the
Mm,
West is charging ahead with this idea of net zero, which is total suicide.
mm,
Why they would be doing this when China, India, and Russia, which is 40% of the world's population, just those three countries, and then if you add South
mm,
Asia, Africa, and much of South America onto that, you have a large majority of the world's population which is not buying into this, is not
no,
accepting there's a climate catastrophe, and only
mm,
paying lip service. China will pay lip
mm,
service. They say in 2060 they will come to the same conclusion that we say we are doing now. Uh, that's a long time from now. We will be dead by then. At least I will for sure. But it, it it is unbelievable that the countries of the Western democracies in particular would go forward without the cooperation of more than half of the rest of the world's population. How can we come to net zero as a planet if China, which is now burning more coal than all the rest of the countries in the world put together, they are burning more than 50% of all the world's coal, and they are building hundreds of new coal fired power stations. I'm not against that because it's putting CO2 in the atmosphere, which is causing the forests and the crops to grow more than they used to. We could go up from 400 to 800 to 1,200 parts per million CO2, and still the plants would grow better because that's what greenhouse growers put in their greenhouse. We know this to be a fact. We know that carbon dioxide was much higher in past eras when the forests were richer than they are today. In the Carboniferous era, which was 350 million years ago, the forests were covering much more of the earth than they do today during a warm climate. It was once a time, not that long ago, and again, now only 5 million years ago, all of Canada's Arctic islands and all of Siberia and all of northern Canada were covered in forests. There was no ice there. And there were giant camels living there and other wildlife. So it's only recently in this period of climate change into the Ice Age, this is only a recent thing. People think the Ice Age is over because we are in an interglacial period. But there have been 45 glacial advances in the Pleistocene Ice Age in the last 2.5 million years. It's all in my book, and it's all on the internet, and it's all in scientific documents. But nobody thinks about 5 million years. They think about 150 years, which, it's ridiculous to base your opinion on global climate on what happened since 1850. It doesn't make any sense at all. Even in 1700, it was colder than it is now, and there was starvation then because it was the Little Ice Age, and crops were failing all across Europe and other parts of the world during that cold period. Thankfully, it started warming again, and only about 1.2 degrees Celsius has it warmed in 300 years. And they say this is an unprecedented disaster. And they are wrong about that. It is not an unprecedented disaster. It is a very welcome little bit of warming from what was quite a nasty cold period 300 years ago.
If you see the prehistoric climate, you have the Middle Age and you have the Roman period where civilization thrives and building stuff is being made, and just like today, we it's comfortable to live on the planet now because it's warmer, just like then. Maybe might be a little colder, but still warm compared to the Ice Age period.
Yes, there has, in this modern era, there has been this almost 1,000-year cycle from the Minoan warm period to the Roman warm period 2,000 years ago to the medieval warm period 1,000 years ago to today's warm period, which, if it goes in the same pattern, will last about another 200 years of very slight warming, and then another cooling period will come on. We don't know the future, of course, but we do know the past fairly well. We don't know why these cycles have been occurring. We have no idea. And that's something else people should understand, is that we know far less about the climate than we know about it. There's so much more we don't know, why these cycles have occurred. We have good knowledge of one of them, though, and that is the glacial cycles. During this Pleistocene Ice Age, as I mentioned, it was 2.5 million years ago that they say, okay, that's when the Ice Age began. And during that time, the glacial periods have been in almost perfect harmony with what's called the Milankovitch cycles. These are 3 cycles, 2 of which have shown to be important in determining when the glacial periods occur and when the interglacial periods occur. The first one is called the 100,000-year cycle of the change in the shape of the Earth's orbit. The Earth's orbit goes from less elliptical to more elliptical. And in this case, the sun's energy is changing in terms of how far away the sun is from the Earth. The last million years, the last 10 glacial cycles, have been on the 100,000-year Milankovitch cycle. These cycles are caused by the gravity of Jupiter and a little bit of Saturn, but mostly Jupiter's gravity. So when Earth and Jupiter come into certain alignments every 100,000 years, you have this cycle occurring. Then there is the cycle of the Earth's tilt on its axis. Obliquity is the science word for it, but the tilt. This tilt changes on 42,000-year cycles. And prior to 1 million years ago, for the first 1.5 million years of this glacial period called the Pleistocene, the cycles were on the 42,000-year cycle and then changed to the 100,000-year cycle 1 million years ago. This is known as the Pleistocene conundrum because we don't know why it changed from the 42,000 year cycle or 41,000 year cycle to the 100,000 year cycle. No one has a clue, but it did, because we have records of this in sediments from the bottom of the ocean, which show us what the temperature curves were, show when the glaciations were at their maximum, show when they came out of the glaciation into the interglacial period, like we have been in for the last 11,000 years, during which human civilization has really come into existence. I mean, humans existed long before that, but civilization, in particular agriculture and then technology, has occurred in this interglacial period. So our whole civilization has only happened in a tiny blink of geological time. And we don't understand that. We think 10,000 years is a long time ago. It's not a long time ago. It's a blink. A million years isn't even a long time ago. Life started 3.5 billion years ago. And for the first 3 billion years, it was pretty boring. It was unicellular, microscopic, and only in the ocean. There was no life on the land until about 450 million years ago, which is quite a while, but it's only a little over 10% of the existence of life, that any life has even been on the land. And at first it was pretty basic life on the land. Everything was kind of flat. And then insects came, and then fish came out and turned into reptiles and amphibians and mammals and reptiles and birds eventually. And this happened over so many millions of years. Evolution is not rapid. It's quite slow, although it has rapid periods when there's rapid change, and comparatively rapid, that is. But another point that I would like to make about the human species, which most people don't understand, is that when you think about it getting too hot for people, the fact is we are a tropical species. Human beings, all of us, came from the equator. That's where we evolved for a couple of million years, coming from some kind of chimpanzee-like thing. We eventually became hominids, as we are known, and walked upright and already had opposable thumbs to hold things with. So a million years of evolution in the tropics, at the equator. If humans did not have fire, shelter, and clothing, all three of those things, they could not have come out of Africa from the equator. A human being without shelter, fire, and clothing cannot live anywhere outside the deep tropics. Impossible. So the idea that if it becomes warmer in Europe, that the people will all die is so stupid. That's not true. People can live in, any people can live in the tropics. And the only climate refugees there are in this world are all of the people from the cold countries flying to the warm countries for a holiday in the winter.
Yeah.
You could call those climate refugees. And
But
so it's the
actually,
exact
many in the
opposite.
US, many in the
Yes,
US, it
and
seems like
Canada.
many they move south, like California and Texas. Many of the US population is kind of like searching this way to the southern states. I guess its climate is one of them. It's easier to live there, more comfortable.
And costs less to heat your home.
Indeed.
Although now they have air conditioning, which does use quite a lot of
Yeah.
energy too. But that's
Then you need
because
to
they just
cool it.
want to be perfectly comfortable at
Mm.
22 degrees Celsius, which is a
Mm.
nice temperature for human beings.
Mm.
Uh, when we get too warm, we like to go swimming in water which is 24 degrees Celsius. And that's just a fact. 28 degrees Celsius is really nice and comfortable for swimming. 30 is good too. So those are the kind of temperatures that make us comfortable. We don't like minus 20 Celsius. We have to wear huge amounts of clothes and go inside and get warm again. So people don't realize this, that the idea that the world will get too hot for life, and Here's another good example about polar bears. People say that polar bears could go extinct if the climate changes too warm. Well, the fact is polar bears wouldn't exist if there wasn't climate change. The polar bear evolved from the European brown bear, which in North America we call the grizzly bear. It's the same species. The European brown bear came to the New World 15,000 years ago when the sea was much lower, 120 meters lower, and the land bridge across the Bering Straits from Asia to North America was land. And people came then, reindeer came, we call them caribou. The timber wolf came, I think we call them the same. And the brown bear came, which we call grizzly bear. The grizzly bear, as the world get colder into the ice age we are in now, the grizzly bear and the polar bear evolved from the grizzly bear because now there was ice forming on the North Pole, and it made sense to have white fur for camouflage, and you had to learn to have a much more carnivorous diet because brown bears eat lots of berries and fruits from the forest. But there are hardly no berries or fruits in the Arctic. So the polar bear had to develop a digestive system a little different from the brown bear. But it is true that even today, because they are not so separate in time, it's only maybe 600,000 years when the polar bear came into existence, evolving from the brown bear, those two can still mate and produce offspring which are viable, which themselves can produce offspring. This is actually the definition of a species. So the polar bear and the European brown bear are not that far apart evolutionary and genetically, so they can still breed together. Now, if the world stayed cold like this for another 5 million years, maybe the polar bear would be so distinct from the grizzly and brown bear they could not mate. But
Yeah.
this is not the case. The polar bear owes its existence to climate change, the world becoming colder. And that is just a fact.
And it survived through a lot of cold and warm period, much warmer than today, and so it should be fine with a little bit of warming today. With the polar bear.
Yes, well, actually, the polar bear survived through at least the last interglacial period, which was over 100,000 years ago, and the one before that, which was more than 200,000 years ago. They were both warmer than this one. So it appears as though the Pleistocene Ice Age may in fact still be getting colder. Because this interglacial period is not as warm as the previous three. We know that for certain. Before that, it's a little more difficult. But we are definitely, in general, at the tail end of a 50 million year cooling period. That graph is in my book. I should try to find it here. Yes, here it is. This graph shows the 50 million year cooling period from the Eocene thermal maximum, which is the peak there at the top, and then the ice age coming on down here. Here's where we are now. We are in this period right here, and this was a bit flat, but this was where it really cooled the most, and then it stayed steady for a while, a little bit warmer than it is now, and then boom, down into the Pleistocene Ice Age, the last 1.5 million years. And if people even understood just that, they would realize that it is not too much to worry about getting warmer. It was warmer forever for 250 million years before this, and life flourished on the Earth. Our ancestors flourished on the Earth before this. And in fact, the ancestors of every single species alive today must have lived through these warmer periods because their descendants are here today. So how could they be here? You know, I'll give you another interesting fact that most people don't think about, is that every single one of us, every insect, every tree, every fish, every living individual of every species on Earth today can trace its history back through an unbroken, successful reproduction since the beginning of life. See what I mean? Nothing just emerged spontaneously, like in the middle of this process. The tree of life is always being pruned, and species go extinct. But those which remain can trace their ancestry back to the beginning. Because life only started once. It didn't start 50 times. So if you see that, and in addition to that, all of the species which exist today, their ancestors came through much warmer periods than what exists today. So they adapted to those warmer periods, much warmer than today, like incredibly more warm. Nobody is even thinking it's going to become as warm as the Eocene thermal maximum today or any time in the near future. We're in an ice age. We're actually, if you look at the graph of just this interglacial period, this 11,000 year period, you will see that it is starting to decline in temperature for the last 6,000 years. We may actually be in the beginning of descending into the next glacial maximum, which would occur about 80,000 years from now. Long time. Don't need to worry about it. Not just yet.
But as a
anyway.
species, humans today are much more adaptable. We can live everywhere because of our technology. So it shouldn't be a problem to adapt to a little bit of warming if we have to. It shouldn't be a problem. We can make
Well,
make it
Ricky,
happen.
it wouldn't be a problem to adapt to warming even if we were still a tropical species. I mean, if the world warms, it would just mean that we could occupy a larger range even without our
Indeed.
technology.
Yeah.
That is a fact. I mean, the only reason humans came even to the whole new world was because of a glacial period that made the sea go down by 120 meters and opened up a pathway from the old world to the new world. And by this time, humans were fully enough evolved to make that trek. But 120,000 years ago, that was that land was there for people to come across if they were there to do so, but they were not ready for that yet. They hadn't invented the necessary equipment or technology to survive at these colder latitudes. But obviously, 15,000 years ago, they had sufficient technology and enough skins wearing on their backs and enough knowledge of fire to take it with them and be able to build a fire every night. They came across the Bering Land Bridge to the New World, and by the time the Spanish arrived with Columbus, there were already 90 million people living in the New World who had come from these few who walked across the land bridge 15 to 16,000 years ago.
So let's move on to the next question. We often hear that researchers and scientists are blamed for being in the pocket of the oil industry if he or she challenges the dogma of human-caused global warming. How much money is actually supporting by the industry, oil industry, versus human-caused global climate change, human-caused climate change? How much money is going into like research of human-caused climate change versus oil money? Do you have a feeling about that?
Well, I'm sure not getting any. The fact is, most of the major oil companies like Shell and Chevron and Exxon have all bought into this as a way of deflecting the anger, I think, of the public. They actually are saying, yes, we agree that we're causing the climate to change. And so they're not much help, actually, in terms of giving the truth about even what they are doing themselves. They refuse to talk about that CO2 is a good thing. I think they are afraid. Like most big corporations are not run by scientists. They're often run by accountants
Mm-hmm.
and people who have very little scientific knowledge. And so they are acting in a purely political way to
Mm.
this whole thing.
Yeah.
And one way it's been described to me is they are so confident that we can't give up fossil fuels,
Mm.
that it's all just a lot of propaganda, that we're going to go net zero, that they will
Mm.
just play along with it. So they are playing
Yeah.
along with the catastrophe narrative in order to
Mm.
deflect attention from themselves, in order to deflect the negativity from themselves. And that
Yeah.
makes it very difficult to defend them uh,
Mm.
because they're admitting guilt. And what are you going to do about that? That's their political strategy, to admit guilt and then do
but
nothing about it, of course,
but do you
except
think
talk.
it's common for oil industry to fund research about natural climate cycles or anything that would go against human caused global warming, or is it just a myth that
No,
every
no,
skeptical scientist is
they're not doing much of anything along those lines.
no?
They are paying lip service to wind and solar energy and
Mm.
you know, trying to sound like progressive, that
Mm.
yes, we agree that we must end fossil fuels someday. Uh, but
Mm.
at the same time, they know that's not going to happen because they are so important to the survival of our civilization every day. And that's the thing people don't understand when they talk about net zero. So we've got this totally unrealistic, fake policy being talked about, that we're going to end the use of fossil fuels, when that is actually not going to happen until they probably run out, which will be a long time from now. Certainly it'll be more than 20 years from now, or 30, I suppose they are saying. And they always make these targets far enough out that you don't have to worry about it now. Like, in fact, I made a bet which I put on the internet. It was covered in 200 different media. I made a $100,000 US bet, a wager, in 2015 after the Paris Accord was signed, that CO2 emissions would be higher in 2025 than they were in 2015. So at 10 years. Nobody would take the bet, not even the Greens. They don't even believe their own BS, right? They don't even believe their own story, never mind the rest of the world believing it. So nobody will bet with me that the CO2 emissions will go down. And it's true, they have gone up, and China's continue to go up. So that is the facts of the world. So we might as well face up to it. So this is why anybody with a brain realizes that the only strategy that makes sense here, if indeed carbon dioxide is changing the climate, which I don't believe, certainly not to an extent worth worrying about, if it is a problem, then we must adapt to the result. Instead of trying to stop the use of fossil fuels, we have to, on the other hand, I do believe that nuclear energy, if the green movement would only accept it as being one of the safest technologies we ever invented, nobody's being injured by nuclear energy today. No, and even at Fukushima, no one was killed by nuclear energy at that, by radiation at that accident, and no one ever will die from the small amount of radiation that people received there. Chernobyl was the
No.
only nuclear accident that caused death to people. So, and it
Mm.
was a stupid reactor design that will never be built again. It was a reactor
Yeah.
that was capable of blowing up. Like it was
Hmm.
actually a nuclear bomb that happened slowly, but it blew the
And they
roof right off the place, started a
and
fire
they
that
do did
lasted
some
for.
tests. They did some tests there where they cancel out all the safety mechanism to run a
Yeah.
test. So it's kind of like it's bad management more than anything else.
But it wasn't
Um,
even, yes, it wasn't even during normal operating procedures.
no.
Uh, but just the same, that reactor had the ability to go critical, whereas none of the
Mm,
others have that
mm,
potential. The Three Mile Island and Fukushima were meltdown accidents that happened after the reactor was shut down, and the heat of the fission products, the decay products, decaying, the heat of them melted the core of the reactor. And that's not supposed to happen, but it isn't an explosion. The hydrogen explosions were another matter. They could have avoided those easily. The Japanese did everything wrong in designing where those nuclear plants were, and in designing the backup for them in case they needed emergency cooling. They didn't have that done properly. And then they made huge mistakes after the accident by allowing those hydrogen explosions to occur inside the containments and make the problem even worse. They could have easily prevented that by just breaching those containments. That's a whole other story. But the fact is, nuclear energy could replace 50% of the fossil fuels we're using today easily, and probably two-thirds. Because everything that is stationary, that is not moving, right, not a vehicle, everything that is stationary could be run with nuclear electricity. All the buildings, all the factories, all the electric motors, everything that requires heat and electricity could be done with nuclear energy. Even all shipping could be nuclear powered, like that boat that just got stuck in the Suez Canal. That could be nuclear propulsion, because 5 countries have nuclear navies that have submarines that go underwater for 3 months with 100 nuclear missiles. If you can do that with nuclear propulsion, you can run super tankers and cargo ships with nuclear propulsion. All the railroads could be electrified, as they are largely in Europe and Japan, but not in North America. And there's lots of other places where the railroads still run on diesel generators that are on board the trains. So all railroads could be electrified. So, but airplanes probably not going to be able to electrify those. And so we should save the fossil fuels for uses that are virtually impossible to replace with any other technology that is efficient and reliable and cost effective, etc. So if the Greens would only accept nuclear energy, a large part of their program become easy to accomplish. It would just happen
mm,
naturally. Uh,
yeah.
but they're not accepting nuclear energy, so there's no way there's going to be a big decrease in the use of fossil fuels anytime soon.
No.
They might as well accept that,
But
but of course they don't.
back to the question. There's a lot of funding going in the direction of human caused global warming. Isn't it so also in U.S. Like organizations like NASA and NOAA? It seems like they are more before, like especially in NASA, before they were known for putting people on the moon and making rockets. Now they seem a little bit more concerned about researching about human-caused global warming more than anything. Is this something that you see also?
Yes, but it's important to recognize that these organizations are not entirely monolithic. Like in NASA, for
Mm,
example, there are the rocket ship people that are trying to go to Mars.
mm,
And then there's the New York office called GISS, Geographical Information System. I don't know what the other S is for, but
mm,
that is totally concerned with climate change. And
mm.
but they are a separate part of NASA. There
Yeah.
are also a group of
But had
retired NASA astronauts and scientists called the Right Climate Stuff who are totally skeptic, but they
mm,
weren't allowed to say it when they were in NASA itself. And in NOAA,
oh,
it's very much politicized. And they call the deep state in the government of the United States is pretty well taken over completely now with the new administration under
mm,
Biden. The deep state, which is the entrenched bureaucracy seeking power and using these
mm,
fear campaigns to gain it, They have control of much of the apparatus, even the military. It's quite a disgrace, actually, but that's not my subject, so I'll just
Mm.
say that. But in terms of
Yeah.
uh, the bureaucracies in the U.S. And Canada now, they're all captured by the climate catastrophe, climate emergency. Nearly every city in
Mm.
Canada has declared a climate emergency when there is no
Oh.
climate emergency. I mean, there are some real emergencies in the world, like a fire when a house is burning or a big building is burning. That would be an emergency.
Mm.
But there is no climate emergency.
No. And it seems hard to get funding for research in anything else than climate change or human caused climate change. If you want to, let's say you want to research about squirrels' life, you will probably get a no. But if you want to research squirrels' impact on climate change, or then most likely you will get the funding because it has something to do with climate change, and they can use that in the propaganda. Uh, and once you get that funding, you might be encouraged to get some kind of result that the politician can use in their propaganda, because maybe you're afraid you will not get it again if you just if your result is just that not really do anything special, then you might not get funding in next time you ask for it.
Well, that's exactly the problem. As I explained before, it's a powerful convergence of interests among key elites,
Mm,
which includes,
yeah.
among others, it includes the activists, the media, the politicians, and the scientists. Also, Hollywood, I guess you could say that's part of media, but they are kind of a different element. But they're all in it together, all scratching each other's backs,
Mm,
and
mm,
all feeding into each other's financial and political interests. So
mm,
it is not a conspiracy theory. Uh, it has elements of that, but it's mostly right out in the open. So conspiracies are behind your back. Uh, this is pretty
mm,
much out in the open. So that's why I call it a powerful convergence of elites. Uh,
mm,
they are looking for control, and in many cases they have gained control over the policies for energy in particular, but also for so many other aspects of our lives that
mm.
I don't know how anything short of some kind of political revolution could end this and bring about some
Mm.
sanity again, but we shall see.
Yeah. Next question is about meat consumption. Uh, is it carbon neutral to eat meat? The, the animals eat the grass from the farmland, and that way, would that make it carbon neutral to eat it afterwards?
Well, the whole carbon neutral idea is stupid to begin with because we are made of carbon, uh, and so is
Mm,
all of other life made of carbon. Wood is 50% carbon. Uh, and
mm,
that's just a fact. So carbon neutral is a stupid term, and so is net zero carbon dioxide emissions. These are made up. They're not scientific concepts
mm,
whatsoever. But with this thing about cows, I I googled the other day. Does Bill Gates, I mean, does Bill Gates know that cows can digest cellulose and we can't? See, cows can digest straw and other cellulose materials that are not edible for us. So they're actually contributing to the world food supply directly by being able to eat grass and straw and what's the corn stover. I don't know your term for that, but we eat the corn, but all the rest of it we can't eat. The plant, we can't eat the plant. Corn, cows can eat that plant and turn it into food. And also when they talk about meat, they never mention the dairy product side of cows, which is huge. The milk and the cheese and the butter and the tzatziki and the cream cheese and all these other products that come from the milk are very important in the world's diet. Now, I guess the true vegans would say, no, we won't eat that either, but that's fine. I don't mind if people make a choice, but I don't think they should be allowed to make my choice. That, again, that's the key, is to do unto others as you would have others do unto you. People should be allowed to make their own choices about what they eat, even if it's unhealthy. Uh, and I know we have this huge problem of obesity in Western society because people are making poor choices in what they eat and how much they eat. But you have to educate people if you expect them to change their behavior. Uh, and some people will and some people won't. But I don't think you can put someone in jail because they're too heavy. You know, it's that's not what we should do. We should try and help them. And the same with food. With food in general, we should allow people to make their own choices with food without these stupid ideas of carbon neutral or net zero, because they are not useful concepts. They don't help with anything. All they do is force very unreasonable rules. And in the end, net zero would basically mean the end of human civilization as we know it. Uh, that is just a fact. We depend on fossil fuels for more than 80% of the world's energy, and the only way to change that formula that I know of is with nuclear energy. Wind and solar cannot do that because they are unreliable, intermittent, and also don't produce enough energy compared to how much energy it makes to produce them. This is the real problem, is in most climates, wind and solar energy don't make enough energy to even produce themselves. Most of the mining and manufacturing of solar and wind equipment is done with fossil fuel energy. And so, in the final analysis, wind and solar are parasites on the larger economy. There's all these subsidies and tax breaks and mandates forcing utilities, forcing the electric companies to buy wind and solar, even when it's more expensive than alternatives. That is why they exist. If it were not for the public money and public policy creating wind and solar energy, there wouldn't be any wind and solar energy. We would be using the ones that actually work, and that is fossil fuels, hydroelectric, and nuclear, and biomass as well. There is, I don't know if you know, in Europe, 4% of the electricity in Europe is produced by burning waste. And that is, you know, combustible materials that would otherwise be thrown away. And North America is a bad example. We in North America we put about 50% of all our municipal waste, or our household garbage, it goes to landfills, and
Oh.
there it's just wasted. Whereas it could be
Mm.
used in state of the art waste to energy facilities, which you have, I think, more than 400 in Europe producing
Yeah.
electricity and heat.
Hmm.
Japan
We
has
have
this
a,
too,
actually
and China.
not far from where I live. We have a larger town. There's a big waste to energy power plant just been built. I think like 4 or 5 years ago, but now they start to close it down. Want to close it down because of the policy about like you're not allowed to burn anything because burning stuff is quote unquote bad for you. So they want to close it, even though it's a big success and everyone is happy. They have cheap, warm, and but politicians want to close it because it's of
No,
the agenda.
they have,
It,
Ricky, they've become so brain dead, like
mm,
lacking in any neural capacity in their head, that they are against
mm,
fire now, right?
yeah,
They are against fossil fuel fire. They are against wood fire. They are against garbage fire. They are against
mm,
all fire. Fire
yeah,
was the reason for the beginning of human civilization.
mm,
They fail to recognize this fact.
mm,
and Therefore, I pronounce them brain dead
Yeah.
and useless,
Or
useless to the future of our civilization. And they should stop. They should stop with
yeah,
this idiocy of being against
yeah.
combustion.
But
Oxidation.
it
It's
seems
called
like
oxidation
it
or
seems like
combustion.
it seems like there are people start to like realize what they're doing because obviously it costs a lot of money to build this power plant, and now they just want to tear it down. It seems like foolish, and people start to realize what is going on, especially in this case. That people start to wonder why it's so like a big problem now. It's been running fine for the last 5 or 6.
Yes, Ricky, the reason they want to tear them down, the reason they're against them is because they want wind and solar
Mm.
to get that money.
Yeah.
That's what they're trying to do with the biomass industry because most people don't realize that biomass is bigger than wind and solar put together in a global basis,
Mm.
much bigger. And so if they can defeat the
Mm.
biomass industry, which provides 24/7 power and heat, like it's not intermittent and unreliable like wind and solar, so it's
Mm.
much better. And and burning waste wood and burning waste garbage, what's wrong with that if you have good pollution control, which
Exactly.
they do
Mm.
these days? So they want that
Right.
market share. You see, they're going
Mm.
for it, and that's
Are
what.
there some kind of lobby in all this climate who makes money of this climate crisis? Is there some kind of like world government or something like? Is there some like lobby or anything you like that make a lot of money of this policy? In,
Well, sure, the whole thing is about money and power, which seem to go
mm.
together quite nicely.
Uh,
Um, the fact is that uh, it's all about money, and it's not just the research money or the Greens money. The big money is in
mm.
energy. If you look at all
Mm.
the money that's going into the climate research and that the Greens are collecting and that the media is profiting and the politicians are getting elected because they save the grandchildren, uh,
Mm.
that money is nothing compared to the
Mm.
amount of money that they want to put into alternative energy and to
Mm.
destroy the fossil fuel industries and make the money themselves. And it's basically welfare energy, uh, the whole wind and solar thing. And
Mm.
they are saying we can have nearly 100% of our energy from wind and solar. Well, yeah, as long as you don't mind it disappearing for a few days at a time. And that's
Mm.
not the way civilization works. We have
No.
built a civilization that is dependent upon continuous energy being available
Mm.
for our various purposes that we use it for.
Mm.
And as we are a 24/7 society.
Mm.
And if we change that, well, as I said, it would be the end of civilization as we know it.
Yeah.
We can't have that. So they have an impossible dream, but they
Mm.
are still determined to try to make it happen because for them it will create great riches, wealth, at the expense of everyone else, including,
Mm.
you know, in the final analysis, a very large drop in population. In other words, that's a nice way of saying mass death
Mm.
from lack of energy.
Do you believe that Greenpeace is cause of CO2 the problem caused the CO2 problem because of the resistance of nuclear power? Um, the hard resistance stopped the development for 40 years and has just picked up over the last 2 or 4 years. Is this some? Did the Greenpeace resistance to nuclear power like stop the development of that energy source?
I'm not quite sure what your question is. If stopping nuclear energy means that fossil fuels are even more important, if because it is easy to replace fossil fuels for
Mm.
electricity production, which is a big part of
Mm.
fossil fuels. It's also possible for many other fossil fuel applications, such as deep sea shipping, railroads, factories, where now they're depending on electricity made with fossil fuels and heat made with fossil fuels, all of that can be produced by nuclear energy. So the potential for reducing fossil fuels, nuclear energy is by far the most important technology to accomplish that in a practical way if that's what we want to do. And so the opposition to nuclear energy is like the green movement cutting its own throat. They
But
they are
wasn't
making
Greenpeace
they are
against
making the biggest. Sorry.
what wasn't Greenpeace in the beginning? Wasn't they against nuclear power? And then in a way like stopping the development or the use of nuclear power.
They still are. Yes. The environmental movement since its beginning has been against nuclear energy, and I changed my mind on this eventually, but it was because of the threat of nuclear war. We thought everything nuclear was evil. When,
Yeah.
as I mentioned, we should have included nuclear energy with nuclear medicine as a beneficial use of nuclear technology. If people would only see it that way, we could get back to building more nuclear plants in Europe and North America, and even Japan, where yes, they had a bad accident, but it's because they did some not very smart things in terms of siting their reactors. Most of the reactors in Japan survived the earthquake just fine, but a tsunami is a different matter. They should not have had those reactors so low down, close to the shoreline, and everything would have been fine. There are 6 nuclear reactors at Fukushima. Number 5 and 6, the last 2, were built on higher ground, and they were not affected by the tsunami. Only the 4 reactors, which were built only 8 feet, only a little more than 2 meters above sea level, which was a stupid thing to do in Japan when there was a history of tsunamis in that location already known. So it, and then they did a terrible job of providing for backup cooling power when the reactor was disabled. And they could have, if they'd had that, even that would have saved the whole thing. Now, it would have not been a bad accident in that case. It just would have been a tsunami that shut the reactor down. If they'd kept the cooling water going with pumps, they could have saved those reactors. But they did not, because they did not think ahead. And they learned a big lesson. And indeed, experience comes from learning lessons. Knowledge comes from learning lessons. And a lot of knowledge was gained in Fukushima, I can assure you.
Dr. Patrick Moore, thank you for doing this today. Was nice to talk to you again. Have a nice day.
You too, Ricky, and hello to everybody who is watching this interview. I'm happy to be with you anytime, Ricky.
I will hold you to that. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Talk to you soon.